Generally speaking, if you want to get someone a little riled up, start talking to them about their finances. And no, I'm not talking generic conversations about investment opportunities or maybe a recent exciting purchase they had. Most people are fine having that sort of conversation. But if you want to get under someone's skin, start talking specifically about their own personal financial situation. How much do they make? How much do they spend? How much do they save? What do they spend their money on? Are they disciplined, or are they sort of more of that free spirit? How much debt do they carry? You start asking too many of these sorts of questions, and you could find yourself on the other end of a dust-up. Finances are such a hot button for most people that the topic consistently appears in the top two things that couples fight about. The second one rotates, but consistently, money comes up in couple arguments. Should you have joint accounts or separate? Whose money is it? Is it your money, my money, our money? What does that money get spent on? One person thinks a purchase is a foolish waste, and the other thinks, well, that's a necessity. We have to have that. And the fighting ensues. Things get messy when it comes to talking about money. And let's just be honest, because sometimes money can make people do some strange things. An unhealthy view of money can cause people to think, say, or do things that maybe they wouldn't otherwise have. Some people have this crippling fear of not having enough money, while others have the fear of losing what they already have. Consider the famous Wendell family of New York City in the late 18 and early 1900s. John D. Wendell in 1859 passed away, and he left an astonishing $3 million fortune. Now consider that, it's 1859. $3 million fortune to his 7 daughters and 1 son, John G. Wendell. And John G. ruled the family with an iron fist. He forbid any of his sisters to marry, and he demanded that they all live according to extraordinarily frugal means. For example, when the last sister finally passed in 1938, the family fortune was worth over $1 billion in today's money. That same sister had one dress to her name. She had made it herself 25 years previous and wore it every day. Upon her passing, over 2,000 people came forward to contest the will and get their hands on some of the money. But in the end, the estate was liquidated across 5 different charitable organizations. We say, yeah, money can do some strange things to people. We think, maybe you've never heard this story, but I thought it was fascinating. The story of Jay Gwaltney in 1980, Chicago radio station WKQX wanted to know, what would someone be willing to do for $10,000? And all these wild proposals came in, but a sophomore at Indiana State University, Jay Gwaltney, had the favorite one. He said, I will eat all of the bark, everything on the outside of an 11-foot spruce tree. Which immediately made me think of Sam, by the way. Sam comes into youth group with pine needle tea and all this spruce. Anyway, so he dressed up in a tuxedo, and he sat at a fancy place setting, and over the course of 3 days and 17 combined hours, he ate every bit of that birch tree. The bark, the leaves, the branches, even the roots. The only condiment he used was some ranch dressing for his birch leaf salad. And at the end of it, he was delighted to get his $10,000, but he complained of a little stomachache. Which you would say, yeah, I can sort of see that. The things that people will do when it regards money. Now, money in itself is neither a bad or a good thing. It's an amoral thing. It's a tool if you use it properly, but a divisive wedge if it's abused. And sometimes all that needs to happen is there to be an accusation of improper use, and the wedge is driven deep. Now, while most people don't like talking about their personal finances in general, how much less do they like being confronted about the way in which they interact with them? Responding to such accusations requires skillful, wise navigation. How much more when it enters the arena of ministry? Just think how many ministries have been ruined by financial impropriety, or even the suggestion of it. How many gospel proclamations have been silenced when money enters the conversation? When gospel matters are in play, the stakes are so much higher, and so the response must be that much wiser. And in our text today, Paul continues his godly defense, and he demonstrates a wonderful response to financial accusations. You see, Paul refused to allow these accusations to silence his faithful proclamation of the gospel. And so let's see together how he handled the attack against him. For context, we're going to read the first 15 verses of chapter 11. We did 1 through 6 last week. We'll do 7 through 11 today. Let's begin in verse 1 so we get the overall idea. I wish that you would be patient with me in a little foolishness. But indeed you are being patient with me. For I am jealous for you with godly jealousy, because I promised you in marriage to one husband, to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. But I'm afraid that just as the serpent deceived Eve by his treachery, your minds may be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. For if someone comes and proclaims another Jesus different from the one we proclaimed, or if you receive a different spirit than the one you received, or a different gospel than the one you accepted, you put up with it well enough. For I consider myself not at all inferior to those super apostles. And even if I am unskilled in speaking, yet I am certainly not so in knowledge. Indeed, we have made this plain to you in everything, in every way. Or did I commit a sin by humbling myself so that you could be exalted, because I proclaimed the gospel of God to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by receiving support from them so I could serve you. When I was with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For the brothers who came from Macedonia fully supplied my needs. I kept myself from being a burden to you in any way and will continue to do so. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be stopped in the regions of Achaia. Why? Because I do not love you? God knows I do. And what I am doing, I will continue to do, so that I may eliminate any opportunity for those who want a chance to be regarded as our equals in the things they boast about. Such people are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Therefore, it is not surprising that his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness, whose end will correspond to their actions. It's again 2 Corinthians 11, 1 through 15. And so last week, Paul launched into a more pointed defense of his role as the apostle to the Corinthians. He made it very clear that while he did not want to engage in the comparison game, he found it necessary to partake in what he calls a little foolishness. It was necessary because of the commitment he had made that was now in jeopardy. Paul had betrothed the Corinthians to Christ, and he took it as his personal obligation, responsibility to guide them in purity until the day of consummation, until the marriage ceremony. He was also concerned that they were susceptible to the same sort of attacks that Eve had fallen prey to. Remember, we talked about this. The serpent preyed on what? On Eve's mind. He attacked her thinking, her mind. He corrupted her thinking by portraying God as one who was untruthful, selfish, miserly with his gifts. He gave her a dazzling alternative in the promise of the fruit, and she happily took the bait. And so now, Paul's afraid that the Corinthians might fall victim to the same thing, to this dazzling alternative of the false apostles who are teaching a different Jesus, a different spirit, a different gospel altogether. Finally, he wanted it to be clear that he was in no way inferior to those phony super apostles. Even if he didn't have their speaking abilities, he certainly knew what he was talking about when it came to the gospel. And he wanted them to think about the fact that he had consistently proven that over his time with them in person and in the letters that he wrote. Well, today Paul's going to turn his attention to these swirling rumors related to Paul's acceptance, or really lack thereof, financial compensation. What part did money play in his proclamation of the gospel? And so let's continue to see together how he defends himself in a godly fashion. First thing to see this morning is that Paul's ministry included a free proclamation. A free proclamation. If you're anything like me, you are immediately skeptical when you hear the word free. Is that phone really free, or am I going to pay for it over the next 24 or even 36-month contract that I'm signing today? Do I really get a free gift with that test drive, or by the time the hard pitch is done, is it going to feel like I've really paid quite a bit for that gift? We're so accustomed to experiencing that reality that it seems like we just conclude, well, nothing in life is really free. We're naturally skeptical of claims that something could truly be free. And at some level, yeah, we're right to think that way. Because nothing is truly free. It might be free to one, but it's at often the expense of another. Someone is always paying for it. You say, well, what about the gospel? Yeah, that's even true with the gospel. Think about it. The gospel is God's good news that mankind can be reconciled to him by grace through faith in his Son Jesus. It's an entirely free gift to those who receive it. They can do nothing to earn it. There's nothing they can do to deserve it. It's entirely and truly free to those who receive it. But at the same time, it isn't free. Well, it's free to all who receive it. It was not free to the one who secured it. Friends, the gospel and its incredible results came at an extraordinarily high cost. The death of the eternal second person of the Trinity. Jesus Christ gave his exalted position in heaven. He gave his rights. He gave the free exercise of his supreme authority, and eventually gave even his own life. Why? So that we might freely receive God's gracious gift of salvation. And so, yeah, there's a sense in which nothing is free. And that's potentially one of the biggest obstacles to people receiving the gospel. They can't get over the fact that there's nothing that they can do to be made right with God. They struggle to believe that for them it really is free, because for Jesus it cost everything. And so many people would rather keep trying to do what they can do to somehow work for it, rather than receiving the work that was done for them. The believers that we have in Corinth, they were also struggling with the idea of free as well. But it's not for the reasons that we might expect. In fact, as we walk through this text today and we examine the financial accusations against Paul, we're going to find that they are completely contrary to the sort of money scandals that most people find themselves wrapped up in today. Rather than being accused of taking too much money, Paul's being dragged through the dirt for refusing to be paid. Listen to what he says. Or did I commit a sin by humbling myself so that you could be exalted? Because I proclaimed the gospel of God to you free of charge? When we examine this more closely, we really start to see the depths of the perversion of Paul's ministry by his opponents. How they consistently wanted to twist and alter his motives and practices to make it seem like what he had done in love was actually an offense to the Corinthians, a sin even. And so, after acknowledging his lack of speaking ability, but quickly following it up that there's no deficiency in my knowledge of the gospel, Paul turns and asks this important question. Did I sin against you? Have I wronged you in some way? Have I missed the mark in the way that I've conducted myself? Now, I want you to take note here. Paul's not asking if he sinned because he collected a salary from them, which, by the way, is something he could have done. He makes it very clear in 1 Corinthians that those who labor in the gospel are perfectly within their rights to be compensated by the people they minister to. He actually reminded them of the truth of the law, which says, you don't muzzle the ox while he's treading the grain, right? In his letter to Timothy, he writes, and he makes it very clear, those who teach the word, they're worthy of double honor. That's a euphemism of being heartily compensated for their labors. And so Paul is in no way against teaching elders or pastors being compensated for their work. But here to the Corinthians, the issue is not about the size of the salary that he drew from them. He's not asking if he sinned because he earned too much money while he ministered to them. He's asking, have I sinned against you because I didn't charge you? Is that really what's going on? And we read that and we think, well, that's kind of strange. Why would anyone conclude that Paul had sinned by freely preaching the gospel of God to sinners? How could they come to that conclusion? Well, to answer that, we have to start by determining what did Paul mean by humbling himself so that they could be exalted? Or more literally, lowering himself so that they might be elevated. We have to understand that in the first century, it was not just gospel evangelists that went around teaching from city to city. Itinerant teaching, specifically in the realm of philosophy, was seen as a legitimate profession. And of course, the goal was to make your entire living doing just that. Just giving your teaching and being paid for it. And so it's been noted that teachers had 4 ways to meet their financial needs in the ancient world. Again, the first and the most desirable is charge for your teaching and have enough people that are willing to pay for that teaching and you can get by. Maybe you can't though. So then the second is to seek out, be employed by, and live with a wealthy benefactor, a patron. Your responsibility then would be educate that patron's children. Teach them in the home, and then once you establish yourself, get out and see if you could gain other business. The third, believe it or not, was just to beg. Start begging. You can't make enough teaching? Beg. The fourth, shockingly, and the least desirable way to meet your needs was to work with your hands. If you had crossed from so-called blue collar to white collar, then it was borderline disgraceful to return to any sort of a trade. The thinking was this: if you have something worth learning, and then people will be willing to pay for it. The more valuable the teaching, the more famous the teacher, the more people are willing to pay. And there's a sense in which not much has changed, right? Why do people willingly pay over $70,000 a year in just tuition costs to go to a Columbia or to go to a Harvard? Why? They perceive that the value of the education is at least that great. The truth of that is, of course, highly debatable, but the perception is there, and so the money is there. It's exactly what it was in Paul's day. Once you had built a reputation for having the knowledge of a particular area of teaching and the skills to present it, there was no need to resort to anything else to have your needs met. But that's not how Paul viewed things. Paul didn't want there to ever be a misperception that he was only sharing the gospel to earn a wage. There were enough so-called experts swindling people out of their hard-earned money. And so he felt if there's even a chance that receiving a wage would hinder the message, I'm not going to do it. Now we'll see in a bit that this was his practice in areas that he was currently ministering in. It didn't mean that Paul never accepted financial help. He did. Just not from those he was initially trying to reach with the gospel. But that meant that there are times that he needed to provide for himself and even for those who were with him. And so he did what he knew to do. He worked with his hands. Paul had learned the trade of leatherworking or tent making probably as a child. Jewish law dictated that boys learned a trade when they were in theological school, and it was typically the one that their fathers knew. And so, in all likelihood, Paul had learned the leather craft from his father. In Acts 18, Paul gets to Corinth, and we see that he meets up with Priscilla and Aquila, who are fellow leather workers or fellow tent makers. And they work together in the craft while Paul proclaims the gospel. You see, Paul didn't mind humbling himself. He didn't mind the sneers from others. He wasn't above getting his hands dirty, quite literally, if it meant that he could preach the gospel free of charge, without any hindrance. And so we see how Paul humbled himself, but in what way did that mean that the Corinthians were elevated? Well, there can be no doubt that the elevation Paul speaks of is their receipt of the gospel that he preached free of charge. Without the potential barrier of a fee for hearing it, the gospel went out freely and was freely received by many. And those who did receive it, well, how were they elevated? In the most spectacular way possible. Friends, to receive the gospel is to be elevated from a child of the devil to a child of God. It is to be elevated from darkness to light. It is to be elevated from idolatrous, self-centered worship to drawing near to the God of the universe. To be elevated from condemnation to justification. To be elevated from enmity with God to peace with God. It's to be elevated from eternal death to eternal life. In Paul's mind, if that meant he had to humble himself and pull double duty for a while, even be looked down upon while he did it, if he had to lower himself in order to give the Corinthians an opportunity to receive the gospel, well, then it was worth it. No problem. Sign me up. But again, here's the perversion of his opponents. After Paul has already come to Corinth, after he has humbled himself so they might be elevated, after he has preached the gospel free of charge to them, well, now you have these so-called super apostles who have come in and they're trying to corrupt their minds. Instead of commending Paul for his selfless actions, they're casting doubt on the legitimacy of his ministry. If he's so knowledgeable, if he really has a message worth hearing, then why does he shame himself by working with his hands? Can't you guys see he's a fraud? He's a phony. A legitimate teacher would never stoop so low as to continue to work in a trade. And so now Paul has to ask, did I sin because I did this? Do you really think that I've wronged you? In asking this question, Paul's getting to an issue that goes even beyond his own humiliation, and hear me now, to the heart of the gospel. Because if they read that question and they conclude, yeah, you did sin, Paul, because you didn't charge us to hear the gospel. You brought shame to us because you had the audacity to work. If the Corinthians conclude that Paul must be condemned for his actions, well, they would need to condemn Jesus Christ as well. If they were looking with any sort of discernment, if we are looking at Paul's ministry properly, then we cannot miss how it is entirely informed and inspired by the actions of Jesus. Was there ever one who humbled themselves more than Jesus? We just mentioned it a few minutes ago. The eternal second person of the triune God left his heavenly dwelling and did what? He humbled himself. He became a man. Let that sink in. God, the eternal creator of the universe, became a part of his creation. And not so that he could be a God king among man. Not so that he could be an emperor or a tyrant. Not so that he could be served whatsoever. He came not to be served, but to serve. And in that serving, give his life as a ransom for many. That he might substitute his perfect righteousness for their sinful record. His sacrificial death for what they deserved. Friends, let's just say it for what it is. Jesus Christ is the ultimate example of humbling himself so that others may be exalted. Was that a sin? Of course not. You would have to be out of your mind to conclude that Jesus' actions were anything but astonishingly selfless. The purest definition or demonstration of love ever given. And so when Paul's ministry follows in the footsteps, and we go, well, it's not to the same degree. Of course not. But when Paul follows the pattern that Jesus showed, should he be guilty of sin? And the answer is, of course not. He wants the Corinthians to take a hard look at what the opponents are saying about him and understand the implications to your own faith if you agree with them. If you condemn me for my practice, you're condemning Jesus Christ. But he's not done yet. Because while it was a free proclamation to the Corinthians, it was also a funded proclamation. While Paul refused to be compensated by the Corinthians, it doesn't mean that he never accepted financial help. Of course, we spent two chapters where he's hitting them up. Be generous, be generous, be generous. But that wasn't for him. That was for the poor saints in Jerusalem. So the question is, does he ever receive financial assistance for himself personally? And the answer is yes, but it's under very specific circumstances. As the text goes on, we start to see a more comprehensive picture of Paul's policy on when to reject and when to receive financial support from the churches he served. Verse 8. I robbed other churches by receiving support from them so that I could serve you. Paul now reveals that while he was not taking any money from the Corinthians, he was getting help from other churches. He describes this help in honestly shocking terms. He says, I robbed other churches. That word is a very strong word. It's the only place in the New Testament, but in extra biblical writings, it's pillaging villages or stripping the dead bodies of soldiers. That's vivid language that Paul is using here for his actions. We'll get back to this idea of robbing in just a few minutes, but for now, see that once again his emphasis is on the fact he didn't do this for himself. He didn't pillage churches to get wealthy. He did it so he could serve them, so he could serve the Corinthians. Now he's going to give us a specific example of what this robbing looked like. We'll add verse 9 on it. When I was with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For the brothers who came from Macedonia fully supplied my needs. I kept myself from being a burden to you in any way and will continue to do so. So now Paul reveals, perhaps for the first time to this Corinthian audience, there was a point during his stay where he found himself in need. That word that you read translated as supplied It can simply mean to fill up, or it can mean to fill up by adding to. And if we consider the context that Paul's already working with his hands, he'd humbled himself in doing that, the idea is that the gift from the Macedonians filled up what was lacking in his work. And no, we don't have exactly the details of what happened, but apparently, at some point, Paul found himself in a financial pinch. Perhaps the tent-making industry was not as hot as it should have been. More probably, he was spending so much time teaching and preaching that he couldn't work as much as he needed to pay for what his needs were and those with him. But either way, he found himself in a financial bind, and then all of a sudden, no doubt providentially, a gift shows up from the Macedonians. Now just let's think for a moment. What do we know about the Macedonians? Philippi, Berea, Thessalonica, right? And what did we just learn back in chapter 8? They were extraordinarily impoverished and afflicted. And yet, in spite of these things, they have an overflow of generosity. This was demonstrated when they begged Paul, can we be a part of the collection? I know we don't have much, but man, we want to be a part of that. Let us in. So they did. But now we see they had personally helped Paul by financially supporting him. We've already mentioned Acts 18. Paul first came to Corinth. He's supporting himself in tent making while he's simultaneously preaching the gospel. But in that same chapter, all of a sudden, we see Silas and Timothy arrive from where? From Macedonia. And the text shifts and says at that point, Paul was entirely devoted to the word. He was entirely devoted to preaching the gospel. And so it is almost certain that that's the incident that verse 19 is referring to. The brothers then would be Silas and Timothy. And of the three possible churches, Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea, it's almost certain that Paul has Philippi in mind. If we consider the letter to the Philippians, Paul describes their past relationship, their consistent, faithful support of his ministry work over the years. He goes all the way back. He says, even when I first left Macedonia, you supported me. And so it's safe for us to conclude the Philippians are the specific church in Macedonia that sends this gift. And so Paul had a definite need, but he says, I refuse to be a burden to anyone in Corinth. That word burden has the idea of being a dead weight. A dead weight. You ever know somebody who's a consistently dead weight kind of leech? Burden to you? They never seem to have it together. They're always, Paul says, I'm not going to do that. I won't. He would not allow his personal need to weigh anyone down in Corinth. But as God would have it, between his personal labor and the gift from the Macedonians, every need was supplied. And so he's resolved, I wasn't a burden then, I'm not going to be a burden now, and I won't be a burden in the future when I come to you again. And so all of this leads to a very important question now. If there were people in Corinth who were willing and able to give Paul financial support, why would he refuse it from them and turn around and rob the poor church in Philippi? Because on the one hand, this is a serious gamble that Paul's taking here. In the ancient world, if you were to refuse an offer of support, that was considered a rejection of friendship. It was a direct insult to the one who offered it. So why? Why reject Corinthian support and receive Macedonian support? I think there's a few reasons. First of all, it speaks to his overall philosophy of ministry and financial support. If you survey Paul's travels from city to city, I don't think there's ever a place that we see that he accepted funds from people where he is actively ministering to them. So while he is in a place, he doesn't receive funds from that place. He wanted to separate himself from false teachers who wanted to line their pockets, even legitimate teachers of other disciplines, but whose main priority is just to make money. Paul's main priority was sharing the gospel. And so he never wanted the exchange of money to be a hindrance to that. However, once he moved on to another territory, he gladly accepted support. In fact, we have some cases where he anticipates, quote, being sent off by churches. That is, funded for the next leg of his ministry journey. This achieved a couple of things. First of all, again, it allowed him to repeat his policy of not charging for the gospel wherever he went. But what does it do for the church sending him? For the church that then funds him that church can express their support for the ministry in a tangible way. They're invested in partnering, that's how Paul refers to it in Philippians, partnering together for the gospel. Why? So that others might have opportunity to receive the same free gift they had. So that's reason number one. The second reason that Paul rejected their support is to keep himself free from any sort of obligation to the ones who gave him the money. It's not uncommon in Paul's time, which frankly, much like our own, for there to be a feeling of duty and responsibility toward the one who provides the funds. As if the one supporting him would be his boss, in a way, and he would be obliged to do the things when and how they wanted. If he received money from those he was directly serving, that temptation might enter the picture. But if a church willingly sent him funds after he was gone, or even as he's leaving, and expected nothing in return, because he's not going to be around to give it, well, that freed him up to do ministry without fear of being controlled by the money, so to speak. That's why he calls it robbing earlier. Of course, he's not actually pillaging the other churches, but there's a sense in which they're very much being robbed, because they were giving him the money and receiving none of the benefits of it. But certainly they had already received the benefits from Paul's ministry. And now their support is so that others might experience the same benefit. Finally, in addition to what we've already discussed, Paul, I think, has a very specific additional reason that he's not going to accept the Corinthian support. At least not right now. First of all, he's headed back to them for another visit. And so his work there is not done. He doesn't want any misunderstanding about the nature of their relationship. And so he's going to continue to make sure he's not a burden to anyone. But beyond that, it's clear the Corinthians have the wrong idea about the relationship to the gospel and financial support. They're buying into the lies of the so-called super apostles. They're being deceived about Paul's motives and his methods. And so as long as that continues, he is not going to feed into their wrong thinking by turning around and accepting payment for the gospel. It just wouldn't be right. And so for now, I'm going to continue to refrain from exercising my pastoral right to ongoing support. And no, Paul's strategy is not mandated for everyone who does gospel ministry, but it should make us think about our own priorities. For those in full-time vocational ministry, it's perfectly acceptable and it's in alignment with the overarching teaching of Scripture to be compensated for that. But whether full-time vocational or friends just being faithfully obedient to the Great Commission, compensation is never the goal of gospel work. Ever. It's giving people the most unhindered opportunities to hear and respond to the gospel. We don't minister to people to be wealthy. We don't do it to be held in high regard. We don't do it to amass a following or gain some special status. We do it first and foremost to be obedient to our Savior and then to be loving to our fellow man. Paul never lost sight of the purpose of his proclamation. We would do well to think about the purpose of our own. First of all, is there a proclamation? And then why are you doing what you're doing? Is it so people will think well of you? Oh, they're such an evangelist. It's amazing. Aren't they incredible? That should never, ever be a motivation for sharing the gospel with someone. Obedience to Christ, faithfulness to the commission we've been given, and love for the lost souls around us. The final thing to see this morning is that Paul was committed to a faithful boast. A faithful boast. You ever wonder how many times Paul was on the brink of just giving up on the Corinthians or churches like them? I mean, ministry on its own is challenging enough. In a couple of weeks, Paul's going to list off all the things that plague him, and then he goes, not to mention my daily anxiety for the churches. It's true. It's physically, mentally, emotionally draining at times. How much more when around every corner your motives and methods are not only being questioned, but they're being twisted around and proclaimed for exactly the opposite of what they are. And so if we were looking at this from a human, fleshly perspective, we might forgive Paul if he just sort of threw up his hands and said something like, you think I'm such a bad guy because I haven't charged you for my proclamation? You think I'm less than these other guys because I haven't bled you dry? Fine. That's what I'm going to do. From now on, I'll bill you for every line of every letter I write. and I'll charge you triple for every hour I visit in person. We might expect that from someone walking in the flesh, but we know Paul didn't want to walk in the flesh. By the Spirit, he wanted to put to death its deeds. And so, as surprising as his next statement might seem from a fleshly perspective, it's exactly what we would expect from someone who is walking in the Spirit. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be stopped in the regions of Achaia. So in order to drive home his point, the significance of what he's about to say, he swears a solemn oath. He says, as the truth of Christ is in me. Let's say that a different way. What I am about to say is nothing less than Christ's truth working in and through me. Or another way, this is important, so listen to what I have to say. And what does he say? My boasting will not be stopped. It will not be silenced. And you say, well, what boast, Paul? It's the boast that he is totally committed to doing ministry free of charge, and that is not going to stop anytime soon. Take note here, though. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, it will not be stopped in the city of Corinth. He says, it will not be silenced throughout all Achaia. Achaia is the southern half of what we know as modern-day Greece today. Corinth is certainly the biggest city, the most important at the time, but there are other churches throughout the area. For example, when Paul writes the letter to the Romans, he commends to them the beloved servant sister Phoebe. Well, where's Phoebe from? Cenchrea. Cenchrea is less than 10 miles from Corinth. It's a port city of which there was a thriving church. I think Paul mentions the regions of Achaia rather than just Corinth for a couple of reasons. First, he wants them to know his policy is consistent. I'm not treating you any differently than I treat all the other churches. This is my policy. Stop taking it so personally. But then at the same time, it's sort of a subtle reminder to the Corinthians, the world in Achaia doesn't revolve around you. You're not the only ones. There are other churches. You are one of many that I faithfully ministered to, free of charge, and I'm going to continue to do the same thing. Now at this point, Paul anticipates another argument from his opponents. I mean, they've been twisting and perverting everything else he says. Why would they stop now? He anticipates that they'll tell the Corinthians that his refusal of their financial support and his unwillingness to change it, well, it proves that he really doesn't care about them at all. If he did, he would bend a little. He would change his position for you. But Paul takes that accusation head on and asks them a rhetorical question. Why? Because I do not love you? I'm certain that it pained Paul to even have to write this question. After everything that he did for the church in Corinth. Again, he basically traveled across the known world to bring them the gospel. He spent a year and a half providing for himself so he could preach them unhindered with no compensation whatsoever. It was one humbling, selfless decision after another, and now here they are questioning the truth of his love for them. Did you ever really love us at all, Paul? And in what feels like a sense of exasperation, Paul simply says, God knows. God knows. If my consistent demonstrations of love haven't convinced you, if you're buying the lies being fed to you by those super apostles, I don't know what else to say. So I will just appeal to the perfect knowledge of God himself. He knows the love I have for you, and that it is from that love I have operated and continue to operate the way that I do. What else can Paul say at this point? God knows. We said it at the beginning, money does strange things to people. It can lead them to think, say, and do things they probably would not do otherwise. But let's just blow it out beyond that, because it's really not money itself. Right? Remember, money is amoral. Not immoral, it's amoral. Right? It's neither good nor bad, it's a tool. And so it's really how money is treated that does strange things to people. How is it spoken about? How is it utilized? And so on. And for the Corinthians, well, they were being influenced by very persuasive and what they believed to be very powerful people. People who had them all twisted up and thinking wrongly about Paul, about money, about their relationship to him and how it all fit together. But in the face of these baseless attacks, Paul has continued to put forward a godly defense. And as he has, he's left us with much to consider about our own lives. So what should we be thinking about as we leave this morning? As a result of God's word, what are our next steps? Well, first is certainly to receive the free gift. Paul freely proclaimed the gospel of Jesus Christ, a gospel that remains free to all who hear it, because Jesus paid the ultimate price for you to be able to receive it. And so if you have not received the free gift of salvation by faith in Jesus, all I can do is urge you, as strongly as I can urge you to do that today. If you think that somehow it's too good to be true, and if you think that somehow you can do something on your own, something that Jesus didn't do to secure it, you're wrong. It's impossible. The only way you will stand on the day of judgment is if you stand clothed in the righteousness of Jesus. And that only happens if you receive it. Today, this morning, he's offering it to you. Free of charge. Acknowledge that you're a sinner. Acknowledge you haven't done what you need to do to stand in his presence. And then receive the work he's done on your behalf. It's only free for you because it cost him everything. So receive it. Humble yourself. This is for all of us. Every single one in here. Paul was willing to be looked down on. He was willing to be sneered at, even shamed, so that he might have just the opportunity to elevate the Corinthians. Friends, for us, where do you need to humble yourself so that another may be exalted? Where do you need to look not only to your own interests, but to the interests of others? Don't ever forget what God says in his word. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And so whenever you're faced, and we're faced this week, you will be faced with decisions to exalt self or humble yourself. And when given that choice, always choose to humble yourself. God will honor that. Finally, keep the main thing the main thing. Well, what does that mean? Faithfully proclaim the gospel of God. Keep the gospel the main thing. That's the most important thing that you've been commissioned to do until you either die or Jesus comes back. Period. Faithfully proclaim the gospel of God, not to be noticed, not to be revered, certainly never for any sort of gain, but again, to be obedient to what God has called you to do, and out of love for him and those who are lost around you. Let's pray.